Nanny discovers the millionaire's son was never deaf. The cruelty came from his own family. It all started with a notebook, small gestures, and a song no one expected him to notice. With each reaction from the child, the house's past seemed to whisper secrets that were never meant to be revealed. When she connected the pieces, she understood that the boy's silence wasn't natural. It was imposed and maintained by those who were supposed to protect him. The road leading to St. Clair's estate wound between ancient pines and the dense fog typical of winter mornings in Aspen. Marcia Harper watched the landscape, which seemed frozen in time, from the bus window, while her fingers nervously clutched the strap of the worn-out backpack she carried. At 32, she had learned that new beginnings rarely came with fanfare or hope. They came, most of the time, disguised as a last resort, a door that opens when all others have already closed. It had been only 4 months since Marcia had left the hospital where she worked as a nursing assistant in Boulder. 4 months since her arms were emptied of that little life that barely had time to breathe. 4 months since the world had lost its color and turned into a succession of identical days, where waking and sleeping were just mechanical obligations. The baby, a girl she had decided to name Helen, was born too premature, too fragile, and the doctors did everything they could. But sometimes, everything isn't enough. Marcia knew this better than anyone. After all, she had spent years caring for people on the brink of loss, but technical knowledge prepares no one for their own pain. After that, returning to the hospital became impossible. Every hallway, every newborn's cry echoing from the maternity wards, every mother smiling with her baby in her arms, was a sharp blade cutting wounds that refused to heal. She resigned without much thought, without plans, without direction. She lived for a few weeks at her sister's house in Golden, but the pity in everyone's eyes around her was unbearable. That's when she saw the discreet ad in a local newspaper. Caregiver needed for a rural property in Aspen, experience with children desirable, housing included. It wasn't exactly what she wanted, but it was what she needed. Distance. Distance from people, from memories, from herself. A place where no one knew her story, where she could wake up without feeling the weight of compassionate gazes. She called the number listed and spoke briefly with a man with a tired voice who asked few questions and seemed more interested in confirming that she could start soon than in checking references. 3 days later, she was on that bus, climbing the mountain road, leaving behind a life she no longer knew how to recognize as her own. The estate's gate was imposing, all wrought iron with the property's name engraved in ornate letters. An elderly groundskeeper opened it without a word, merely gesturing toward the dirt road that led to the main house. Marcia grabbed her backpack and walked the 500 yards that separated her from the mansion. The building was old, made of stone and wood, with tall windows and a wide porch that wrapped around the entire facade. It had an air of elegant neglect, as if time had stopped there decades ago and no one had had the courage to move it again. She was greeted by Robert Miller, the owner of the property. He looked like a man who carried the world on his shoulders, disheveled graying hair, deep dark circles under his eyes, an unshaven beard. He must have been about 45, but he looked 10 years older. He wore simple clothes, jeans and a plaid shirt, and his brown eyes had that characteristic dullness of someone who has given up looking for light in things. "Marcia, right?" His voice was deep but polite. "Come in, please. Thank you for coming so quickly." She just nodded, following him into the house. The interior confirmed the external impression: old, well-preserved furniture, but covered in a thin layer of dust. Paintings on the walls showed rural landscapes and family portraits. In one of them, Marcia recognized a younger Robert next to a beautiful woman with a wide smile and wavy brown hair. A small child was in her lap. "My wife, Julianne," Robert said, following Marcia's gaze. There was no need to explain the use of the past tense. Her absence was imprinted on every corner of that house. "And this is Gabriel, my son. He's 7 now." "It's a pleasure to be here," Marcia replied, her voice coming out softer than she intended. "You mentioned on the phone that Gabriel has special needs." Robert took a deep breath, as if gathering strength to repeat an explanation he had given many times before. "Gabriel is deaf," since he was a baby. Profoundly deaf, the doctors said. He doesn't react to sounds, doesn't speak, doesn't communicate much. We tried everything, hearing aids, therapies, sign language. Nothing worked. He lives in his own world, you know. He carries a stuffed animal everywhere, a blue rabbit his mother gave him when he was little. It's the only constant in his life. There was something more in those words, a layer of guilt and resignation that Marcia recognized immediately. She herself carried similar feelings, though for different reasons. "May I meet him?" she asked. Robert hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "He should be in his room. He spends most of his time there. Doesn't like to go out much. I'll take you." They climbed a wooden staircase that creaked with every step. The second-floor hallway was dark, lit only by a window at the far end. Robert stopped before a half-open door and knocked lightly, even though he knew. The boy wouldn't hear. It was an automatic gesture, one of respect. The room was surprising. While the rest of the house exuded melancholy and neglect, this space was full of color. The walls were covered with children's drawings, most of them done with crayons. There were also boards with visual symbols, drawings representing daily actions, eating, sleeping, playing, bathing. A low table was filled with toys arranged in an almost obsessive manner. And there, sitting on the floor near the window, was Gabriel. The boy had light brown hair, fair skin, and green eyes that seemed to see something. No one else could. He held the blue stuffed rabbit against his chest, rocking gently back and forth. He didn't look at the door when they entered, didn't show any sign of knowing someone was there. His world seemed hermetic, untouchable. "Gabriel," Robert called, his voice thick with emotion, approaching slowly. He lightly touched his son's shoulder. The boy turned his face, recognized his father, and then looked back at the window, without any expression. Marcia observed everything in silence. There was something there she couldn't name, an intuition that was beginning to form. It wasn't pity she felt, nor discomfort. It was curiosity, perhaps, or recognition. This boy lived locked inside himself, just as she had been living for the past few months. "I'll let you two get to know each other gradually," Robert said, running a hand over his face in a gesture of exhaustion. "Your room is at the end of the hall. You can get settled, rest. We'll talk more about the routine tomorrow." He left, and Marcia stood there, watching Gabriel. Slowly, without making any sudden movements, she sat on the floor a few feet away from the boy. She didn't try to touch him, didn't force eye contact. She just stayed there, breathing in the same space as him. Minutes passed. Gabriel continued to rock, clutching the rabbit. Then something happened. One of the toys on the table fell to the floor with a sharp clatter. Marcia noticed the boy's fingers twitch slightly, as if he had felt something. It wasn't an obvious reaction, but it was there. She filed that information away mentally, without commenting. The following days were ones of silent adaptation. Marcia took over Gabriel's care routine with a discretion that surprised Robert. She didn't invade the boy's space, didn't try to force interaction. She prepared his meals, helped with his bath, changed his clothes, but always observing, always taking notes. One afternoon, while washing dishes in the kitchen, she accidentally dropped a pan. The metallic clang echoed through the house. Marcia ran to the living room doorway and saw Gabriel, who had been playing on the floor, turning his head slightly, as if looking for something. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but it was there. She then began to pay attention at other times. When Robert slammed the front door on his way out to tend to the animals, Gabriel would sometimes blink faster. When the wind rattled the windows more forcefully, the boy's fingers would move restlessly. They were faint, inconsistent reactions, but they existed. Marcia bought a simple notebook at the only stationery store in Aspen and started to record everything. Time of day, type of sound, distance from the sound source, Gabriel's reaction. It seemed obsessive, perhaps even crazy, but she needed this. She needed something to focus on besides her own pain, something to give purpose to the days that felt all too similar. 2 weeks after her arrival, while organizing a forgotten closet in the basement, Marcia found a dusty box full of old items. Among them was a large pair of headphones, one of those models from the 90s, still connected to an old Walkman. The battery was dead, but she took the device to her room and managed to find a compatible charger in town. That night, after putting Gabriel to bed, Marcia thought, if the boy reacted to vibrations, perhaps he would also react to more intense frequencies, to sounds that could be felt as well as heard. She downloaded some music with deep, strong beats at styles that used a lot of bass and percussion. It wasn't music she would normally listen to, but it wasn't about her taste. The next afternoon, while Gabriel was sitting on the living room rug making his repetitive drawings, Marcia approached carefully. She placed the headphones near the boy without touching him and pressed play. The music started and the volume was high enough for the vibrations to be intense. Gabriel stopped drawing. His fingers were suspended in the air, holding the crayon. Then, slowly, he turned his face toward the sound. His green eyes widened, and for the first time since Marcia had arrived, she saw something in them besides emptiness. It was confusion, perhaps even discomfort, but also curiosity. Her heart raced. She continued to watch, without moving. Gabriel reached his hand toward the headphones, touching them with his fingertips. He frowned. Then, completely unexpectedly, his lips moved, and a sound came out. It wasn't a clear word. It was a confused, disjointed attempt, but it was something. It was a voice. Marcia felt tears burn her eyes. She slowly turned off the music, put the headphones away, and left the room before Gabriel could notice her emotion. She went to the bathroom, locked the door, and cried silently. It wasn't sadness, it was relief, it was hope. It was the first time in months she had felt anything other than emptiness. That night at dinner, she told Robert what had happened. He listened to her in silence, with a skeptical expression. "Marcia, I appreciate your effort, but we've heard this before. Several therapists said they saw progress, that Gabriel was responding. In the end, it came to nothing. He's deaf. The tests confirmed it. He's not going to talk, he's not going to hear. I've learned to accept that. I know what I saw," she insisted, keeping her voice calm. "It wasn't my imagination. He turned his head, he reacted. Something is happening." Robert sighed, rubbing his face with his hands. "I don't want to create false hope. I've been through this. I've believed too much and been disappointed too much. I prefer reality, however harsh it may be. I'm not asking you to believe blindly. I'm just asking you to observe. Look at him. See for yourself." He didn't answer, but Marcia saw something flicker in his eyes. It wasn't hope yet, but it was doubt, and doubt at that moment was a start. In the following days, Robert began to pay more attention to his son. He spent more time in the same room with him, observing discreetly. And he saw when Gabriel turned his head at the sound of a glass breaking in the kitchen. He saw when the boy flinched at the sound of distant thunder. He saw when, for the second time, Marcia played the music, and Gabriel again moved his lips, this time with a clearer syllable. "Mom." The word was almost inaudible, but it was there. Robert felt the floor disappear from under his feet. For 7 years he had believed he would never hear his son's voice. For 7 years he had carried the guilt of not being able to connect with him. And now, suddenly, this. "How is this possible?" he asked, his voice trembling. "I don't know," Marcia answered honestly. "But we need to find out. We need to understand what's happening to him." It was then that an investigation began that would change everything. Marcia went back to Gabriel's room and searched every corner for any medical information. It was in a locked drawer of Robert's desk that she found an old folder full of yellowed documents, medical reports, prescriptions, consultation notes, and in the middle of it all, several empty medicine boxes with names she didn't recognize. She took one of the boxes to her room and spent the night researching on her phone. What she discovered sent a chill down her spine. The medications were part of an experimental neurological stimulation program for children with atypical development. However, there were serious allegations associated with them. Several families reported that continuous use had caused irreversible hearing damage in previously healthy children. The next morning, Marcia confronted Robert with the empty vials. He turned pale when he saw them. "Where did you get these?" "From your desk." "Robert, what is this? Why was Gabriel taking these medications?" He looked away, and Marcia saw there was shame there. It was right after Julianne passed away. I was desperate. Gabriel was so withdrawn he didn't react to anything. A highly recommended doctor offered me a spot in an experimental program. He said it would help Gabriel develop better, connect with the world. I trusted him. I signed the forms, gave him the medicine every day for almost 2 years. And you didn't suspect anything when he started to lose his hearing. They said it was a coincidence, that Gabriel had a genetic predisposition, that the program had nothing to do with it. I wanted to believe them. I needed to believe it wasn't my fault. Marcia sat down heavily. Robert, you need to tell me everything. Who was this doctor? Where is this clinic? Do you have documents, contracts? I did, but when I questioned them, after I suspected something was wrong, they made everything disappear. They said there was a fire in the archives. I tried to sue, but I didn't have enough proof. I gave up. I thought it was better to move on, to focus on caring for Gabriel the way he is. But what if he's not the way you think he is? What if his deafness isn't complete? What if there's still a chance? Robert looked at her with eyes full of tears he refused to let fall. I don't know if I can go through this again. I don't know if I have the strength for another disappointment. Marcia held his hands, squeezing them firmly. Then let me be strong for both of us. Let me believe. Because if there's a chance, even a small one, that Gabriel can have a different life, we have to try. He said nothing, but he didn't pull his hands away. And in that silence, between two people devastated by loss and united by a fragile hope, a fight began that neither of them could have imagined where it would end. Meanwhile, in the second-floor room, Gabriel held his blue rabbit and looked out the window. Inside him, somewhere no one yet knew how to reach, something was awakening. A memory, perhaps, or a possibility. The sound of the voice he thought he had lost forever echoed in his mind like a distant whisper, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel completely alone. The following weeks transformed the routine at St. Clair's estate into something completely different. What was once a monotonous succession of silent days became a race against time, against bureaucracy, and against Robert's own fears. Marcia took charge of the investigation with a determination she didn't know she possessed. It was as if, in trying to save Gabriel, she was saving a part of herself she thought was lost forever. The first task was to gather all possible evidence. Marcia made copies of all the medical documents Robert had kept, photographed the medicine vials, and wrote down names, dates, and dosages. Then she began to search for information about the doctor responsible for the experimental program. Dr. Evan Carter Myers, a neurologist who at the time enjoyed an excellent reputation in Denver. The internet revealed a disturbing story. Myers had been suspended from his duties at Denver General Hospital after a series of complaints from families who participated in his programs. There were reports of at least 15 cases of children who developed severe hearing problems after using the medications he prescribed. But the doctor was never formally convicted. He claimed the cases were statistical coincidences, that the children already had a genetic predisposition, that the parents were looking for someone to blame for inevitable conditions. With expensive lawyers and influence in medical circles, he managed to close most of the lawsuits with out-of-court settlements that included non-disclosure agreements. He silenced everyone, Marcia said one night, showing Robert the articles she had found. He bought these families silence. But if we can prove that Gabriel is another victim, we can reopen the case. Robert sat at the kitchen table, a cup of cold coffee in his hands. He had aged visibly in recent weeks, but there was also something different about him, a spark that hadn't been there before, hope, perhaps, mixed with anger. How are we going to prove it? I don't have the program documents anymore. They got rid of everything. We'll start with Gabriel. We need to take him to real specialists. Get new tests with updated equipment. If we can prove he has some auditory perception, that's a start. The next task was to convince Gabriel to leave the house, something that hadn't happened in months. The boy had an extremely rigid routine, and any change made him anxious. But Marcia had a strategy. She spent days preparing him visually, drawing the route they would take, showing him pictures of the doctor's office, creating a story in pictures about what would happen. And, most importantly, she used music. Every afternoon, Marcia would put the headphones on Gabriel and let him feel the vibrations of the songs. Gradually, the boy began to associate that moment with something positive. His drawings changed. Before, they were just repetitive circles and lines. Now they included human figures, crudely drawn musical notes, and something that looked like a woman's face with long hair. Marcia. Robert watched everything with a mixture of fascination and fear. One afternoon, while Gabriel was drawing in the living room, he sat next to Marcia on the porch. "You know, if this doesn't work out, it'll be worse than before, right?" he said in a low voice. "If we create hope and it's destroyed again, I don't know if I'll survive." Marcia looked at him with understanding in her eyes. "I know, believe me, I know better than anyone what it's like to have hope ripped away from you. But the difference is that this time we're not creating hope out of thin air. Something real is happening with Gabriel. You saw it, you heard it. What if I'm seeing what I want to see? Then we're both seeing it. And Gabriel is feeling something too, that's undeniable." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You know, Julianne was always the strong one between us. When she passed away, she took my ability to believe in good things with her. Gabriel was only 2, I didn't know how to raise a child alone, especially a child who couldn't hear me, who didn't react when I called his name. It just got worse and worse. When the doctor offered that treatment, I clung to it like a drowning man to a piece of wood. I signed everything without reading it properly, gave him the medicine without question, and by the time I realized Gabriel was getting worse, that he was ceasing to react to any sound, it was too late. You didn't know. I should have known. I should have investigated, questioned, protected my son." Marcia lightly touched his arm. "You were doing what you thought was right. No one can blame you for that. But now you have a chance to fix it, to seek justice, not just for Gabriel, but for all those other children." Robert looked at her, and there was gratitude in his eyes. "You had no obligation to do any of this. You could have stayed quiet, done your job, and that's it. Why are you getting so involved?" Marcia took a moment to answer. When she did, her voice was thick with emotion. "Because I lost my daughter and I couldn't save her. But maybe I can save your son, and that has to mean something, doesn't it? There has to be some purpose in everything we go through." They sat in silence for a few minutes, watching Gabriel through the window. The boy was completely absorbed in his drawings, oblivious to the adults' conversation, but there was something different about him, a liveliness that wasn't there before. Finally, they managed to take Gabriel to Denver for new tests. Marcia went with them, and the 2-hour drive was tense. Gabriel was restless in the car, clutching the blue rabbit to his chest, but she put the headphones on him with soft music, and that helped. Robert drove in silence, his fingers tight on the steering wheel, lost in thought. The clinic was in the Cherry Creek area, a modern glass building. The neurologist who received them was a woman in her 50s, with grey hair tied in a bun, red-framed glasses, and a serious but kind expression. Dr. Patricia Nolan had an excellent reputation, and when Marcia contacted her explaining the case, she agreed to see them quickly. "Mr. Miller, I understand Gabriel was diagnosed with profound deafness at 2 years of age. Do you have the reports from that time?" Robert handed over the folders he had brought. The doctor examined everything carefully, taking notes. "And you believe he may have some level of auditory perception. What is that based on?" It was Marcia who answered, showing the notebook where she had written down all her observations. "He reacts to intense vibrations, especially low-frequency ones. He turns his head, twitches his fingers, sometimes even verbalizes syllables." Dr. Nolan frowned. "Verbalizes? Do you have a recording of this?" Robert took out his phone and showed some videos they had recorded in recent weeks. The footage showed Gabriel with the headphones on, reacting to the music, moving his lips, making sounds. The doctor watched with growing interest. "This is extraordinary. If he truly has profound bilateral deafness, this type of reaction shouldn't be happening. We need to run a full battery of tests: audiometry, auditory brainstem response, an MRI. I want to understand exactly what's going on." The tests took all day. Gabriel was surprisingly cooperative, perhaps because Marcia was always by his side, holding his hand, showing him drawings that explained each step. When they finally finished, they were all exhausted. The results would take a few days, but Dr. Nolan already had some initial impressions. She called them into her office, sitting before them with a grave expression. "Look, I'll be honest with you. The initial analyses show there is brain activity in response to low-frequency sound stimuli. It's not normal hearing, far from it, but it's not complete deafness either. It's as if Gabriel has a very narrow window of auditory perception that was never explored." Robert felt his legs go weak. "How is that possible? He had tests when he was a baby." "Tests can be wrong, Mr. Miller. Equipment can be miscalibrated. Professionals can misinterpret results. But there's another possibility that worries me more." She paused. "You mentioned Gabriel participated in an experimental medication program. I need to know exactly what substances were used." Marcia showed her the names she had written down. The doctor typed them into her computer, her expression growing darker. "These compounds were banned by the FDA 3 years ago. Studies showed they cause damage to the auditory nerve in developing children. They don't cause complete deafness, but they create a type of lesion that makes normal sound perception very difficult. The problem is that this lesion can be partially reversible if treated early, but if it's not, it can become permanent." Robert put his hand to his mouth, stifling a sob. "I did this to my son. I hurt him." "You were deceived," Dr. Nolan corrected him firmly. "The doctor in charge knew the risks and didn't inform you properly. That's a crime. Medical malpractice, and it needs to be reported. We've tried. He has powerful lawyers. Then you need to try harder, with new evidence. And I'm going to help you. I will write a full report on Gabriel's case, including my assessment that the auditory damage is consistent with the use of those substances. This can be used in a lawsuit." Marcia felt a wave of relief. "Thank you, doctor. Thank you so much. Don't thank me yet. The road ahead will be long and difficult, but this boy deserves justice, and so do you." The drive back to Aspen was silent, but it was a different kind of silence. It was no longer the heavy silence of resignation, but the reflective silence of someone who needs to process information that is too big to grasp. Gabriel slept in the back seat, wrapped in a blanket, the blue rabbit clutched to his chest. When they arrived at the estate, it was already night. Marcia helped Robert put Gabriel to bed, and then they went down to the kitchen. She made tea, and they sat at the table, exhausted but restless. "So it's real," Robert finally said. "He can hear something, and I ruined it by giving him those damned pills." "You didn't ruin anything. The damage can be treated. The doctor said there are possibilities. Therapies, specific devices, auditory training. Gabriel can have a different life. And will Myers pay for what he did? If we do everything right, yes." Robert took a sip of tea, his hands trembling slightly. "I spent so long blaming myself, blaming the world, even blaming Julianne for leaving me alone with all of this. But I never blamed the person who truly deserved it. That man destroyed my son's life in the name of an experiment. And how many other children? We need to find them, Robert. We need to join forces." In the following days, Marcia plunged into an obsessive search. She contacted support groups for families of children with hearing loss, posted discreet messages on medical forums, and looked for lawyers specializing in medical malpractice. And slowly she began to get responses. A mother from Colorado Springs reported that her son developed hearing problems after participating in the same program. A father from Fort Collins told an identical story. A grandmother from Pueblo said she had always been suspicious of the medicine, but the doctors made her feel ignorant for questioning them. There were more than 10 families with similar stories, all silenced by out-of-court settlements that prevented them from speaking publicly. "They're scared," Marcia explained to Robert one night. "Scared of breaking the agreements and losing the money they received. Scared of retaliation. But if we can prove Gabriel's case, maybe they'll find the courage." That's when things started to get dangerous. One morning, Marcia woke up to strange messages on her phone. Unknown numbers telling her she should stop looking for trouble, that she was messing with powerful people, that it would be better for everyone if she just gave up. She blocked the numbers, but they kept coming. One afternoon, on her way back from the market in Aspen, she noticed she was being followed. A black car with tinted windows kept a constant distance behind her. Marcia sped up, took detours, and finally the car disappeared. But the message was clear. Someone was watching. She told Robert everything that night, and he turned pale. "Marcia, this is getting serious. Maybe we should back off." "Back off after everything we've discovered?" "Robert, they're scared. That's why they're trying to intimidate us, but we can't let them win." "What if they do something worse? What if they try to hurt you, or Gabriel?" She had no answer for that. The fear was real, palpable, but the thought of giving up was even more unbearable. It was Dr. Nolan who suggested the next step. She called a few days later saying she had spoken with a lawyer specializing in cases against doctors and institutions. He was willing to take the case pro bono as long as they could gather enough evidence. "But there's a catch," she warned. "You need to be prepared for a war. Myers won't give up easily. He'll use every resource he has to discredit you. They'll say you're negligent parents looking for scapegoats. They'll question your sanity. It's going to be brutal." Robert and Marcia looked at each other. There was fear in both their eyes, but also determination. "We're ready," Robert said, and so the process began. The lawyer, a man named Henry Travers, came to the estate to meet Gabriel in person. He was young, maybe 35, with perfectly combed black hair and an impeccable suit, but there was genuine passion in his eyes when he spoke about justice. "I've read Dr. Nolan's report. It's solid, but we need more. We need to show a clear timeline. Before the medication, during the medication, after the medication. The more documentation, the better." They spent weeks gathering everything. Old photos of Gabriel as a baby, home videos where he reacted to sounds, medical reports from before the experimental program. Every little detail mattered. Meanwhile, Marcia continued to work with Gabriel. The boy was changing visibly. He no longer spent so much time isolated in his room. He began to explore the house more, to follow Marcia around the kitchen, to sit on Robert's lap while they watched cartoons on TV. And most incredibly, he began to try to communicate verbally more often. The words were still jumbled, poorly articulated, but they were coming. Ma for Marcia. Pa for Robert. Bun for the rabbit. They were fragments, but they were connections. They were bridges being built between Gabriel and the world. Robert filmed everything, every bit of progress, every word, every smile. And at night, when Gabriel was asleep, he would watch the videos and cry. He cried for the hope he had lost, for the anger of being deceived, for the immense love he felt for this boy who was finally starting to reach out. One afternoon, while Gabriel was drawing in the living room, he did something unexpected. He picked up a pink-colored pencil and drew a female figure with long hair. Then he pointed to Marcia and said with surprising clarity, "Mum." Marcia felt the world stop. It wasn't technically correct, she wasn't his mother, but to Gabriel, in that moment, she was. She was the constant presence, the voice he was learning to recognize, the arms that held him. She was the bridge between him and the world that had for so long seemed inaccessible. She knelt beside him, her eyes filled with tears, and hugged him carefully. Gabriel didn't pull away. On the contrary, he rested his head on her shoulder, and there they stayed, two survivors of immense loss finding comfort in each other. Robert watched from the kitchen doorway, and something was both breaking and rebuilding inside him. Guilt, gratitude, love, fear, hope, all mixed in a whirlwind impossible to name. That night, after putting Gabriel to bed, Marcia and Robert sat on the porch, wrapped in blankets against the mountain chill. The sky was starry, clear, beautiful in a way that seemed impossible given everything they were facing. "Thank you," Robert said suddenly. "For what?" "For not giving up, for believing when I couldn't, for giving my son something I thought he would never have." Marcia smiled, but there was sadness in that smile. "You know, when Helen died, I thought I'd never be able to look at a child again without feeling that gut-wrenching pain. But Gabriel taught me that love doesn't have to be a replacement. It can be an addition. I can love my daughter who is gone and love the boy who is here. Both things can exist together." "Julianne would have said that too," Robert murmured. She was always better than me at accepting things as they are and still finding beauty in them. They sat in silence, each lost in their own memories and hopes. And inside the house, Gabriel slept peacefully, dreaming of colors, music, and voices he was finally beginning to understand. But the storm was just beginning, and they didn't yet know how violent it would be. Autumn arrived in Aspen, bringing with it stronger winds and even colder temperatures. St. Clair's estate, once a place of oppressive silence, now buzzed with activity. Henry Travers had become a constant presence, showing up 2 or 3 times a week with documents to sign, strategies to discuss, and updates on the lawsuit. The case against Dr. Evan Myers was officially open, and the legal machine was beginning to move, slowly but relentlessly. But what Marcia and Robert hadn't expected was for the resistance to be so fierce. Myers had a lot to lose, not just his reputation and money, but his own freedom if it was proven that he knew the risks and administered the medication anyway. And men with so much to lose are dangerous. It started subtly. An article was published on a Denver news website claiming that a father in Aspen was suing a renowned doctor based on questionable evidence, driven by desperation and denial about his son's true condition. The article didn't mention names directly, but anyone who knew the case could identify Robert. The text suggested that parents of children with disabilities often looked for external culprits instead of accepting reality, and that this was harmful not only to themselves, but to the health professionals trying to help. Robert read the article with trembling hands. "They're painting me as a lunatic, as if I'm making all this up." Henry, who was present when the article came out, remained calm. This was expected. It's the classic strategy. Discredit the whistleblower before they can even present the evidence. But we have the evidence. The medical reports are solid. The videos are indisputable. They can try to tarnish your reputation, but they can't change the facts. "And what about the other families?" Marcia asked. "Will they have the courage to join us after this?" That's when they received the first piece of great news. One of the mothers Marcia had contacted, a woman named Regina Adams from Colorado Springs, decided to break her non-disclosure agreement and join the lawsuit. She was willing to testify, even knowing she would lose the money she had received in the out-of-court settlement. Henry was euphoric. This changes everything. If she testifies that she went through the same situation, that she was coerced into signing the agreement, that other families were silenced, we start to have a proven pattern of misconduct. Marcia called Regina that same night. The conversation was long, emotional, filled with tears on both sides. Regina had a 9-year-old son, Michael, who had also developed hearing problems after the experimental program. Unlike Gabriel, Michael had retained some hearing, but was left with neurological damage that affected his cognitive development. "For a long time, I blamed myself," Regina said, her voice thick with emotion. "I thought it was me, that I had done something wrong during the pregnancy, that I hadn't taken good care of him. But there was always a small doubt about those medications. When I saw your post on the forums, everything made sense, and I can't stay quiet anymore. My son deserves justice. All these children deserve it." Regina's decision encouraged other families. Within 2 weeks, 4 more parents contacted them, willing to testify. Each brought a piece of the truth. Dosages altered without consent, side effects ignored, manipulated medical documents. It was a mosaic of negligence and greed that was becoming impossible to ignore. But the backlash was swift. One night, Marcia was home alone with Gabriel, as Robert had gone to town to run some errands. She was making dinner when she heard the sound of breaking glass. She ran to the living room and saw that someone had thrown a rock through the window. Wrapped around it was a handwritten note. "Stop while you still can. The next one won't be just a rock." Marcia's heart pounded. Gabriel was in his room safe, but the fear was immediate and visceral. She locked all the doors, checked all the windows, called Robert and then the police. When Robert got home half an hour later, he found her sitting on the kitchen floor, holding Gabriel, trembling. "They know where I live. They know I take care of him. Robert, what if they come back? What if they do something worse?" Robert sat on the floor beside her, putting his arm around both of them. "They won't. We won't let them. I'll install cameras, alarms. I'll hire someone to stand guard at night. You and Gabriel will be safe, I promise." But the intimidation didn't stop. Days later, Marcia received calls from blocked numbers in the middle of the night, with only heavy breathing on the other end. Then, someone opened the gate to the horse pasture during the night, and the animals escaped, taking hours to be found. They were small acts of violence calculated to create constant fear. Henry insisted that everything should be documented and reported to the authorities. This only proves that they're desperate. Innocent people don't resort to intimidation. The trial was set for 3 months later, and the preparation was intense. Henry spent hours rehearsing testimonies with Robert and Marcia, anticipating difficult questions the defense might ask. He explained that they had to be prepared for their lives to be publicly dissected, that every mistake, every imperfection would be used against them. "They'll say you're an absent father, Robert. They'll question why it took you so long to notice something was wrong. They'll suggest that Gabriel's deafness could have other causes you neglected to investigate." "And me?" Marcia asked. "How will they attack me?" Henry hesitated. "They'll say you're projecting your own trauma onto Gabriel, that you lost a child and are trying to compensate by attaching yourself to his in an unhealthy way. They'll question your qualifications to care for a child with special needs. They'll insinuate that your observations are too subjective, too emotional." Marcia felt sick to her stomach, but forced herself to maintain her composure. "Let them say what they want. The truth is on our side." Meanwhile, Gabriel continued to progress. Dr. Nolan had recommended a speech therapist specializing in auditory rehabilitation, and twice a week Marcia took the boy to Denver for sessions. It was tiring, the trips were long, but the results were visible. Gabriel began to associate specific sounds with objects and actions. When Marcia clapped her hands, he would look immediately. When they called his name in a louder tone, he would turn his head. It wasn't normal hearing, but it was communication. It was connection. The speech therapist, a young woman named Beatrice, was impressed with every session. "I've never seen a case like this. It's like his brain is relearning how to process sound. The damage is there, but he's creating alternative pathways. It's extraordinary." One day during a session, Beatrice played a simple children's song and asked Gabriel to clap along, told her the rhythm. At first he couldn't, but after a few tries his eyes lit up with understanding, and he started clapping, not perfectly in sync, but trying. Marcia cried right there, in the therapy room, over an achievement that would be trivial for any other child, but for Gabriel was monumental. The videos of these sessions became crucial evidence for the lawsuit. Henry explained that proving Gabriel was improving after stopping the medication was fundamental to the argument that the medication had been the cause of the problems. As the trial date approached, the tension mounted. Robert barely slept, spending his nights reviewing documents, taking notes, mentally preparing himself to face Myers face to face. There was so much accumulated anger, so much resentment for lost years, for progress that could have happened sooner if Gabriel had received the right treatment from the beginning. One night, Marcia found him in the living room sitting in the dark, looking at an old photo of Julianne. "Do you think she'd be proud of me?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Marcia sat beside him. "I'm sure of it. You're fighting for your son. You're facing things that would scare anyone. You're being brave." "I don't feel brave. I feel terrified." "Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what needs to be done despite the fear." Robert looked at her, and there was something different in his eyes. "You know, I couldn't have done any of this without you, right? You came into our lives and changed everything. Gabriel changed, I changed, this house changed." Marcia felt her face grow warm. The closeness between them had grown naturally over the past few months, but she had always tried to maintain a professional distance, to remind herself she was there as an employee. But the truth was that it had long since ceased to be just a job. Gabriel had become the child of her heart that she couldn't raise, and Robert had become someone she trusted, someone with whom she shared fears and hopes in a way she hadn't with anyone since losing Helen. "I didn't do anything special," she murmured. "I just paid attention." "You paid attention when no one else did. You believed when I had already given up. That's everything, Marcia. That's all that matters." They sat there side by side in the dark, and for the first time in a long time, neither of them felt completely alone. 2 weeks before the trial, the incident that almost destroyed everything happened. Marcia was in Denver with Gabriel for another speech therapy session when Robert received an unexpected visitor at the estate. It was a man in an expensive suit with perfectly coiffed grey hair, a spokesperson for Myers' lawyers. "Mr. Miller," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "I've come to make a proposal that I believe will be in everyone's best interest. My client is willing to make a generous settlement, a substantial compensation, lifelong medical treatment for your son, all documented and guaranteed. In return, you drop the lawsuit and sign a non-disclosure agreement." "No," Robert said immediately. The man didn't seem surprised. "You didn't even want to hear the figures. We're talking about enough money to secure Gabriel's future. Education in specialized schools, cutting-edge therapies. Everything he needs. My son doesn't need money stained with guilt. He needs justice, and so do the other children." "Ah, yes, the other families." The man's tone grew colder. "Do you realize you're dragging these people into a process that could last for years, that will expose their lives that might come to nothing in the end? Is that what you want for them, for yourself? I want the truth to be known. I want Myers to pay for what he did." The man sighed, putting the papers back in his briefcase. "It's a shame, a real shame. I had hoped you would be more reasonable, Mr. Miller, but very well, you've made your choice. I just hope you don't regret it when things get really difficult." There was a veiled threat in those words, but Robert didn't flinch. He closed the door in the man's face and immediately called Henry to tell him what had happened. "Excellent," the lawyer said. "The more desperate they get, the more we know we're on the right track. But Robert, I need you to be aware. The trial is going to be brutal. The defense will use everything they can. They'll try to discredit Dr. Nolan. They'll question the validity of the videos. They'll say Gabriel is being manipulated. Be prepared." The day of the trial dawned with an overcast sky and the threat of rain. The courthouse was in downtown Denver, an imposing and intimidating building. Robert wore the best suit he owned. Marcia chose a sober and discreet outfit. Gabriel would stay with Beatrice, the speech therapist, during the trial. It would be too intense for a child. The courtroom was packed. On one side, Henry's team, including Dr. Nolan and Regina, the mother from Colorado Springs who had agreed to testify. On the other, a row of expensive lawyers representing Myers, who entered the room with the erect posture of a man accustomed to winning. He wore an impeccable navy blue suit, well-cut grey hair, and an expression of confidence that bordered on arrogance. When his eyes met, Robert's, there was no remorse in them. There was only calculated coldness. The trial began with opening statements. Henry presented the case clearly and directly. Gabriel had been the victim of an improperly approved experimental program with medications that caused severe auditory damage, and the doctor in charge knew the risks, but chose to ignore them for profit and professional recognition. The defense countered by painting Myers as a wronged pioneer, a dedicated doctor who tried to help children that other clinics had given up on. They claimed the side effects were rare and unpredictable, that all parents had been informed of the risks, and that the non-disclosure agreements were standard procedure to protect the family's privacy. The first to testify was Robert. He took the stand with trembling legs, swore to tell the truth, and sat down. Henry guided him through the basic questions: when Gabriel was diagnosed, how he was introduced to the program, what happened afterward. Then came the cross-examination. The defense attorney was a tall man with glasses and a deep voice he used as a weapon. "Mr. Miller, you signed the consent form to participate in the experimental program, correct?" "I signed it, but I didn't fully understand what I was signing." "You are an educated man, you have a college degree. Are you telling me you signed a 10-page document without reading it?" "I was desperate. My wife had recently passed away. My son wasn't reacting to anything. When Dr. Myers said he could help, I trusted him." "You trusted him? Interesting. So you're suing a doctor because you trusted his word too much? Isn't it more sensible to assume that perhaps you didn't pay close enough attention?" Henry stood up. "Objection, Your Honor. The defense is blaming the victim." "Sustained." Rephrase the question. The lawyer adjusted his glasses. "Mr. Miller, after Gabriel's initial diagnosis of deafness, Did you seek second medical opinions? Not immediately. Why not? Because Dr. Myers said it wasn't necessary, that he was taking care of everything. But you, as a father, don't you have a responsibility to seek other opinions when it comes to your son's health? Robert clenched his fists. I did what I thought was right at the time. I was alone, overwhelmed, trusting a renowned professional. Alone, that's an interesting word. You mentioned you hired several caregivers over the years. None of them stayed long. Why? I don't know, they would leave. Or did you drive them away because you were difficult to deal with your grief, your rigidity? Objection. Henry was on his feet again. Irrelevant to the case. It is relevant, Your Honor. We are trying to establish the emotional context of the home, which may have influenced Mr. Miller's perception of his son's condition. The judge considered. Objection sustained. Let's stay focused on the medical issues. The questioning continued for another hour, trying to dismantle every argument, every observation, every piece of evidence. When it finally ended, Robert left the stand exhausted, feeling exposed and vulnerable. Marcia was next. She also swore an oath and sat down, trying to remain calm. Henry guided her through the observations she had made, Gabriel's behavioral patterns, his reactions to music. The cross-examination was even more aggressive. Ms. Harper, you're not a medical doctor, correct? No, I'm a nursing assistant. And yet you feel qualified to make diagnoses about a child's hearing condition. I didn't make diagnoses. I made observations. Observations? You lost a baby a few months ago, did you not? Marcia's stomach turned. Yes, but that has nothing to do with... It has everything to do with it. You were in deep mourning, emotionally fragile when you took over Gabriel's care. Isn't it possible that you are projecting your own maternal desires onto this child, seeing progress you want to see instead of real progress? No, her voice came out firm. I filmed everything. It's not my imagination. You filmed it with what kind of equipment? Professional? With proper technical controls? With my cell phone. So they are home videos made by a person with no training in medical assessment, who was emotionally involved with the child. And counsel expects this court to base a decision on that. Henry rose again. Your Honor, the videos have been analyzed by qualified professionals who have confirmed their authenticity and clinical relevance. And we will call those professionals to testify, the judge replied. Dr. Nolan took the stand next. Her credibility was impeccable, and she presented the reports with clarity and precision. She explained in technical terms how the medications caused lesions on the auditory nerve, how these lesions were consistent with Gabriel's condition, and how the new tests proved there was partial auditory perception that had never been detected before. The defense tried to shake her testimony, but she was unflappable. For every question, she had a scientifically backed answer, references to studies, concrete data. When Regina took the stand to testify, the room fell silent. She was a small, thin woman with hollow eyes that had cried too much, but her voice was firm as she told her story. How she trusted Myers, how her son Michael developed problems, how she was coerced into signing a non-disclosure agreement under threats of losing everything. I was afraid, she said, her voice breaking, afraid I wouldn't be able to pay for Michael's treatment if I lost the settlement money. Afraid of being sued, afraid that no one would believe me against such a powerful doctor, but I can't live with this fear anymore. My son deserves for me to fight for him. When Regina left the stand, there were tears in the eyes of several people in the room, including the judge. The trial lasted for 3 days. Experts were called, other parents who also decided to testify, professionals who had worked with Myers and had their own suspicions. The mosaic of evidence became denser, more impossible to ignore. On the last day, Myers finally took the stand. He denied everything with a conviction that almost seemed sincere. He said the medications were safe, that he had done everything by the book, that the cases of hearing problems were statistical coincidences. He said he had dedicated his life to helping children and was being unfairly persecuted by parents who couldn't accept their children's conditions. But when Henry confronted him with internal clinic documents showing he had been warned about the risks and chose to continue, when he presented emails where Myers discussed strategies to silence dissatisfied families, when he showed financial records proving he profited significantly from the experimental program, the lies began to unravel. Myers lost his composure. He started to stammer, to contradict himself, to blame other professionals. The mask of confidence fell, and what was exposed was a man driven by greed and arrogance who put his interests above the well-being of vulnerable children. When the judge adjourned the session for deliberation, Robert and Marcia left the courtroom hand in hand, exhausted but relieved. They had done everything they could. Now it was a matter of waiting. The verdict would be announced in a week. 7 days that felt like an eternity, where every minute was laden with a mixture of anxiety and hope. And when the day finally came to hear the verdict, the entire St. Clair's estate seemed to hold its breath, waiting for a justice that had for so long seemed unattainable. The week of waiting for the verdict was one of the longest Robert and Marcia had ever lived. Each day seemed to drag on infinitely, filled with an anxiety that wouldn't let them sleep right, eat right, or think about anything else. They tried to maintain a normal routine for Gabriel's sake, but the boy could sense the tension in the air. He clung to Marcia more, held his blue rabbit tighter, and looked at his father with those green eyes full of questions he didn't yet know how to put into words. Henry called every day with small, almost insignificant updates that helped pass the time. The judge was carefully reviewing all the evidence. It was a complex case with many ramifications. The press had begun to cover the trial, and the story was gaining national attention. Other parents were coming forward, saying they too had participated in suspicious experimental programs. It was bigger than anyone had imagined. "Regardless of the outcome," Henry said in one of his calls, "you've already done something important. You've brought this issue to light. You've made people pay attention." But for Robert, none of that mattered if there was no justice for Gabriel. On the 4th day of waiting, something unexpected happened. Gabriel was in the living room with Marcia drawing when he suddenly put his pencil down and looked directly at her. There was an intensity in his gaze she had never seen before. Then slowly he opened his mouth and said, with a clarity that made her heart stop, "Thank you." It wasn't perfect. The pronunciation was slurred, the syllables a bit disconnected, but it was a complete word. And more than that, it was a word filled with meaning. Gabriel knew what he was saying. He knew he was expressing gratitude. Marcia dropped what she was doing and knelt in front of him, holding his face in her hands. "You're welcome, my love. You're welcome." And then something even more extraordinary happened. Gabriel leaned forward and rested his forehead against hers, in a conscious, intentional display of affection. It wasn't just a reaction to external stimuli, it was a true emotional connection. Robert, watching from the doorway, felt tears stream down his face. It had been such a long, painful, uncertain road, but there, in that simple moment of a boy thanking the woman who cared for him, was everything he had fought to achieve. Communication, understanding, love. That night, after putting Gabriel to bed, Robert and Marcia sat on the porch, as they had done so many times in recent months. The sky was clear, the full moon illuminated the surrounding mountains, and the cold mountain air enveloped them like an embrace. "You know," Robert began, his voice low, "when Julianne passed away, I thought my life was over too, that I would never feel anything again but pain and emptiness. I spent years just existing, not really living. Gabriel was there, but I couldn't reach him, and it was eating me up inside." Marcia listened in silence, knowing he needed to say this. "And then you showed up, not with ready-made answers or empty promises, but with observation, patience, care. You saw my son in a way I had forgotten how to see him. And in the process you helped me see myself too. Robert, let me finish." He turned to her, taking her hands. "I don't know what will happen with the trial. I don't know if we'll win or lose, but I know that regardless of the outcome, you've changed our lives. You've changed my life, and I need you to know that I'm grateful, immensely grateful." Marcia felt tears burn her eyes. "You don't have to thank me. You saved me too. When I got here, I was lost, empty, without purpose. Gabriel gave me a reason to wake up in the morning, to believe that I can still make a difference in the world. And you—" She hesitated. "You showed me that it's possible to start over even after losing everything." They stayed there hand in hand, in a silence that wasn't uncomfortable, but filled with mutual understanding. Two broken people who had helped each other piece themselves back together. "What happens after the trial?" Marcia asked after a while. "I don't know. It depends on the result. But one thing I do know. I want you to stay. Officially. Legally. I want to adopt you as Gabriel's guardian if you'll accept. He needs you. I need you." Marcia looked at him in surprise. "Robert, that's a lot." "It's the right thing to do. You're the mother he recognizes, the one he calls for when he's scared, when he's happy, when he needs comfort. Paperwork doesn't change that. It just makes official what is already true." "And us? What are we?" It was a brave, vulnerable question. Robert took a moment to answer. "We're survivors, Marcia. We're two people who have been through immense loss and found each other on the other side. I don't know what this will become in the future, but I know I want to find out, if you want to as well." She smiled, a small but genuine smile. "I do." The day of the verdict arrived on a rainy Friday. The sky was heavy with dark clouds, and the cold was biting. Marcia left Gabriel with Beatrice again, promising to be back soon. The boy didn't want her to go, holding her hand tightly, and she had to promise several times that she would return. In the courtroom, the room was even more crowded than during the trial. There were reporters, parents of other affected children, health professionals interested in the case, observing lawyers. Everyone was waiting for the verdict that could change so many lives. Robert and Marcia sat next to Henry, who was visibly tense. Regina was there too, accompanied by her husband, both holding hands. Across the room, Myers sat rigidly in his chair, his face an expressionless mask. When the judge entered, everyone rose. He was a man in his 60s, with completely white hair and a serious but not harsh expression. He sat, adjusted his glasses, and opened the folder before him. "Before I read the sentence," he began, "I would like to make a few remarks. This has been one of the most complex and emotionally charged cases I have presided over in my career. On one side, we have families devastated by damages they believe were caused by medical negligence. On the other, a respected professional who has dedicated decades to the care of children with special needs. The responsibility of deciding the truth in this case is immense, and I do not take it lightly." Robert felt his heart pound. He couldn't read the judge's expression, couldn't predict what was coming next. After carefully reviewing all the evidence presented, all the testimonies, all the medical reports and documents, I have reached some fundamental conclusions. The room was in absolute silence. You couldn't even hear breathing. First, it has been proven that the medications used in Dr. Evan Myers's experimental program contained substances that, in subsequent studies, were associated with auditory damage in children. Second, it has been proven that the doctor was aware of initial reports of these side effects and chose to continue administering the medications without proper investigation. Third, it has been proven that several families were coerced into signing non-disclosure agreements under undue pressure. Fourth, it has been proven that Gabriel Miller, as well as other children, suffered damages consistent with the use of these medications. Marcia squeezed Robert's hand so hard, her nails dug into his skin. "Therefore," the judge continued, his voice growing firmer, "I find Dr. Evan Carter Myers guilty of gross medical malpractice, of intentionally exposing minors to inadequately approved treatments, and of coercion to obtain non-disclosure agreements. He is permanently barred from practicing medicine in this country, must pay substantial damages to all affected families, and will face criminal charges for his actions. The previous non-disclosure agreements are deemed null and void due to proven coercion. Furthermore, I order a national inquiry into all experimental programs in which the defendant was involved, to identify other potential victims." The silence in the room broke in an explosion of emotion. Regina began to cry uncontrollably, embraced by her husband. Other parents present stood up, relieved and emotional. Reporters rushed into the hallways to break the news. Henry hugged Robert tightly, saying something he couldn't hear in the commotion. And Robert just stood there, paralyzed, trying to process that they had won, that Gabriel would have justice, that all those months of struggle, fear and intimidation had been worth it. Marcia was crying, her hands covering her face, and he pulled her into a hug, and there they stayed, two survivors celebrating a victory that had seemed impossible. Myers was led from the room by security guards, his face finally showing the defeat he had tried to hide. His last words were bitter, "You've destroyed a dedicated man's career." But no one was moved. He had destroyed much more than careers. Outside the courthouse, under the light rain that was falling, Robert and Marcia faced the cameras and microphones. Henry led the press conference, but at one point, Robert asked to speak. "I want to thank everyone who supported us on this journey. But most of all, I want to say to all parents of children with special needs, ask questions, seek second opinions, don't accept ready-made answers. Pay attention to your children, even when it seems like they're not paying attention to you, and never ever give up fighting for them." His voice broke at the end, but he managed to finish, and when he got back to the car with Marcia, he felt as if an immense weight had been lifted from his shoulders. The following months were a time of intense transformation. The compensation guaranteed by the verdict was substantial, but Robert didn't want the money for himself. He decided to use it to create an auditory rehabilitation center on St. Clair's estate itself, a place where children like Gabriel could receive proper treatment, free of charge, in a welcoming environment. Marcia embraced the project with enthusiasm, and together they began to transform part of the property. The main house was renovated, maintaining its rustic charm but adding accessibility and modern resources. An annex was built with therapy rooms, audiometry equipment, and spaces for music therapy. Dr. Nolan agreed to be a medical consultant for the project, visiting regularly to supervise the treatments. Beatrice, the speech therapist, was hired full-time. Gabriel was the first child officially enrolled in what became known as the Helen Claire Auditory Rehabilitation Center, a tribute to both the daughter Marcia lost and the estate that had welcomed them. The boy continued to progress remarkably. With intensive therapy and the use of specialized hearing aids that amplified the specific frequencies he could perceive, Gabriel began to develop a unique form of communication. It wasn't traditional hearing, but it was functional. He learned to associate specific sounds with meanings, began to speak more words and interact with other children. The inclusive school he started attending was in Aspen, and for the first time in his life, Gabriel had friends. Children who didn't see his condition as a limitation, but just as a characteristic. He still carried the blue rabbit everywhere, but now he also carried a backpack full of drawings to show his classmates. Marcia began technical training in occupational therapy, specializing in children with special needs. She wanted to understand more, do more, help more, and she discovered she had a talent for it, a natural ability to connect with children that others considered inaccessible. Robert, for his part, began to write. At first, it was just personal notes, a way to process everything he had been through. But Henry suggested turning it into a book, a complete account of their journey, from the early days of denial to the victory in court. The book was published a year after the verdict, with the title Silence Interrupted, a story of listening, fighting, and hope. It became a national reference in discussions about the rights of children with disabilities and medical ethics. Sunday mornings at the estate became special. Robert and Marcia would wake up early, prepare a lavish breakfast, and call Gabriel. The three of them would sit at the table, and Robert would play music while they ate. Gabriel would react to each song, sometimes moving his lips trying to sing along, sometimes just drumming his fingers on the table, but always present, always connected. It was on one of these mornings, almost 2 years after the verdict, that Robert asked the question he had been saving for months. "Marcia, will you marry me?" She stopped with her coffee cup halfway to her mouth, her eyes wide. "What?" "There's no ring, no getting on one knee, nothing romantic," he said with an embarrassed smile. "But there's sincerity. I love you. Gabriel loves you. You're already part of this family in every way that matters. All that's left is to make that official too." Gabriel, who was drawing nearby, looked up as if he understood the importance of the moment, and then, with a clarity that surprised them both, he said, "Marry. Mommy, stay." It wasn't perfectly articulated, but the message was clear. Gabriel wanted Marcia to stay. Forever. She looked at these two males, a broken adult who had rebuilt himself, a silent child who had found his voice, and knew there was no other possible answer but yes. "Yes, I will." The wedding was simple, held at the estate itself, with few guests. Dr. Nolan was there, so was Beatrice. Henry served as a witness, and Regina came with her family, including Michael, who had become friends with Gabriel. The children ran around the property during the party, and their laughter echoed through the fields in a way that had seemed impossible just a few years before. During the ceremony, Gabriel stood next to Robert, wearing a little blue suit he had chosen himself. When the officiant asked if there were any objections, Gabriel raised his hand and everyone held their breath. But what he said, in his unique and effort-filled voice, was, "Happy. Everyone happy." There wasn't a person at that ceremony whose eyes didn't fill with tears. Life at St. Clair's estate settled into a new, healthy, purposeful rhythm. The rehabilitation centre served about 20 children regularly, all receiving free treatment. Marcia and Robert worked together in the administration and found they made a good team. He was organised and pragmatic. She was empathetic and creative. They complemented each other. Gabriel became, in a way, the symbol of the centre. His story inspired other families not to give up. And he loved showing the new, scared children who arrived that it was indeed possible to have a good, rich, fulfilling life, even with limitations. One spring afternoon, 3 years after it all began, Marcia was in the centre's garden watching Gabriel play with other children. He was teaching a younger boy how to use the music therapy equipment, showing him how to feel the vibrations, explaining with gestures and simple words. He was only 10, but he already showed incredible maturity. Robert came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her. "What are you thinking about?" "About how strange life is," she replied, leaning against him. 3 years ago I was completely lost, without direction, without hope. And now look where I am. Married, caring for a son I love as if I had given birth to him, running a centre that helps dozens of children. If someone had told me this was possible, I wouldn't have believed them. And Helen, do you still think about her? Every day, but it doesn't hurt in the same way anymore. Now it's a gentle ache, full of love and memory, but one that doesn't paralyze me. I think she would be happy to know that her passing, in some twisted and painful way, led me to Gabriel. To you." Robert kissed the top of her head. "Julianne would be happy too. She always wanted me to find someone who would make me smile again. I think you two would be pleased to know that your legacies live on in us." That night, after putting Gabriel to bed, Marcia stayed in his room for a little longer. She watched the boy sleep peacefully, the blue rabbit in his arms, and thought of all the people who had gotten them to this point. The families who found the courage to fight, the professionals who donated their time and knowledge, the justice system that, despite its flaws, worked when they needed it most. She thought of Myers, who was serving a prison sentence and had lost everything. She didn't feel sorry for him, but she no longer felt anger either. She just felt the peace of knowing that justice had been served. She went down to the living room, where Robert was reviewing the expansion plans for the centre. He looked up and smiled when she entered. "Come here." She sat next to him on the sofa, and he pulled her into a hug. There they stayed, in comfortable silence, listening to the sounds of the house, the wind in the trees outside, the life pulsing around them. "You know," Robert said after a while, "the irony is that I spent years obsessed with Gabriel's silence. I thought it was the worst punishment, not being able to hear him, not being able to communicate with him. But the real silence wasn't his. It was mine. I had shut down emotionally, stopped talking about pain, about loss, about love, and it was only when I started to break that silence that things changed." "I think we all have our silences," Marcia replied. "Things we don't say because it hurts too much, because we're afraid, because we don't know how. But what I've learned is that silence only has power when we let it stand alone. When we share it, when we open up, it loses its strength. And Gabriel taught us that. Gabriel taught us a lot. Patience, perseverance, that limits are just challenges waiting to be overcome. But most of all, he taught us that connection doesn't have to be perfect to be real. It doesn't have to be conventional to be profound. Robert nodded, kissing her forehead. I love you. You know that? I know. And I love you too. The years continued to pass, bringing new changes, new challenges, new joys. Gabriel grew into an articulate young man, though his speech was never perfectly normal. He didn't care. He had friends, he had passions, he had dreams. He wanted to study music therapy. When he grew up, to help other children the way he had been helped. The Helen Clare Auditory Rehabilitation Center expanded, serving not only children from the region, but from all over the state of Colorado. It became a model for other centers in different parts of the country. Marcia wrote academic articles about her techniques of observation and emotional connection with neurodivergent children. Robert became a public speaker, telling his story at medical conferences and events on the rights of people with disabilities. But the most important thing of all was that they were happy, not a perfect happiness, without problems or difficulties, but a real happiness, built on a solid foundation of love, respect, and shared purpose. On a winter afternoon, exactly 5 years after the verdict that changed everything, the family was gathered on the estate's porch. Gabriel, now 12, was playing an adapted keyboard that Beatrice had developed especially for him. The keys had not only sounds but specific vibrations that he could feel and differentiate. He was playing a simple but beautiful melody that he had composed himself. Marcia and Robert watched hand in hand, and there was something whole about that moment. It wasn't perfection, but it was completeness. It was the feeling that despite everything they had lost, despite all the suffering they had gone through, they had found something valuable on the other side. They had found each other. They had found purpose. They had found home. "Dad, Mom," Gabriel called, turning to them. His voice was clearer now, the result of years of intensive therapy. "Did you like the music?" "We loved it," Robert answered, his voice thick with emotion. "It's beautiful," Marcia added. "What did you call it?" Gabriel smiled, that smile that lit up his entire face. "I called It Found Voices, because that's what happened to us, right? We got lost in the silence, but then we found our voices together." Marcia felt tears stream down her face, but they were good tears of gratitude and love. "Yes, my love, that's exactly what happened." As the sun set over the Aspen Mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, St. Clair's estate filled with music, laughter, and voices that once seemed lost forever. And in that moment, looking at her happy son, at her husband by her side, at the life they had built together from the ashes of their losses, Marcia knew with absolute certainty that every tear, every fear, every moment of pain had been worth it. Because from the deepest silence can emerge the most beautiful symphony when there is love, courage, and people willing to listen not just with their ears but with their hearts. End of story. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Marcia, Robert, and Gabriel has deeply touched your hearts. If you were moved by this journey of resilience, justice, and love, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments what marked you most about this story. Was it the fight for justice, the love that was born from pain, Gabriel's transformation? Every day we bring intense stories like this one, which reveal the deepest and truest side of the human soul, stories that make us reflect on courage, hope, and the extraordinary capacity we have to begin again. We look forward to seeing you in the next episode with another narrative that will stir your emotions.